welcome to another episode of Ton's Two Cents podcast. Today's episode is titled Built to Move or Built to Stall? The Future of Transportation and Who Decides. We will explore how transportation decisions shape access, safety, and long-term mission outcomes. I'm your host, Ton Wilson, and with us today is Julie Evans, a professional engineer and senior strategist at the Texas A&M Technology Institute and a senior advisor for small businesses, including Toxel and Tower Consulting, with decades of experience across the transportation ecosystem. Julie brings a rare combination of technical depth and strategic perspective, helping agencies and industry partners navigate the complex transportation challenges from infrastructure planning and funding strategy to program execution and long-term system integration. She understands how to connect policy, innovation, and real-world delivery in a way that actually moves the mission forward. Julie, thanks for joining us here today, and say hello to our listeners, the intellectuals, and tell them a little bit about yourself.
Thank you. Yeah, good evening. I'm delighted to be on your podcast. Todd and I have had the pleasure of getting to work together on several different occasions. But yeah, a lot of my work, most of my work has focused in transportation, spanning kind of the engineering side to the policy side. I got started in federally funded R&D, looking at what was possible in an era where we were still in 3G and the Internet of Things for cities wasn't really something people could get their heads around. So I've worked with local governments, state governments, the feds. I've worked as a small business owner. I've worked for small businesses. I've advised small businesses, and also for, big defense contractors and nonprofits. So the landscape is very rich. I've enjoyed this career a lot because of how dynamic it is. And maybe we'll see what we can get into today.
And I love the fact that you and I have not only a professional background, but a personal background. And I think that's so important in this industry. It's all about the relationships that we kind of build. And I really appreciate and enjoy our years of friendship too. So I think our intellectuals are going to really look forward to this conversation because it is a conversation between peers and friends and colleagues.
Yeah.
So before we jump into the policy and the infrastructure side, and I think it's so timely with the president's budget, with everything that's been going on with TSA and the FAA, that we talk about policy and infrastructure side of the conversation. But you spent your career, helping move some pretty large, complex systems forward. But let's take it down a little bit into some real life for a second. And when you, I know that you love to travel, and so do I. And so when you travel personally, are you the type of person who kind of shows up at the airport 3 hours early with a full plan? Or are you just kind of cutting it loose and grabbing some coffee and kind of easing your way to the gate?
I have recently been converted. I have always been arrive no sooner than you really need to. I fortunately live very close to DCA and have made a lot of my housing and and other decisions based on commute times to the airport and to my work. But I travel with a very close friend on a regular basis, and I give her tremendous anxiety if we leave too late. So I've been converted that when I travel with other people, I'm more than happy to go earlier. But when it's just me, it's like 13 minutes door to gate, and I register that as a significant privilege, one that I take full advantage of.
Yeah, exactly. And that was one of the reasons, or at least one of the factors that I put into when we moved to Houston was how close can I get to George Bush without being, in an inconvenient or a really rough area of Houston. But I do miss my days of Reston where from my house to my gate through Clear, it was like 15 minutes, right? I
Yeah,
just, on like a bad day, maybe 20 minutes. So, um, we do have
absolutely.
some privileges that like other people don't have. But yeah, you're right. I'm the same way. When I travel with other people, like my one girlfriend, it gives her anxiety.
And it's totally understandable. I don't know. Maybe I'm more comfortable flying by the seat of my pants.
Yeah, I think it just depends on how experienced you are as a traveler, right? So now I actually like to go there a couple hours early, go to the lounge because I'm bougie like that,
The
and
lounges
just
have
kind of
changed
have a couple of drinks.
everything.
Just changes
Absolutely.
everything. Exactly. So let's just dive straight into our first segment about who gets funded and who gets really left behind. Because it's so like we could not have timed this more perfectly around the release of the president's budget. But we like to think that transportation funding is objective, and it's not. It reflects priorities, influence, there's trade offs. Everyone's jockeying for something. And when you look at how the Department of Transportation funding actually gets distributed and what's driving some of these decisions, like what what goes on behind the scenes here? And as you answer that, I'd love for you to kind of touch on some of the imbalances between like some of the states and the communities, because geographically it's very different too. And there's, and between like maybe traditional like road and multimodal type of priorities, because I love the fact that you have a background in so many different, modes of transportation that most of us only think of two, right? The air and, and our cars, but infrastructure and transportation is a very diverse topic.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I remember very early on, I was in grad school for my transportation policy work, and I had an incredible professor. She was amazing, and she said, you know, you can't call it a good policy unless you can say out loud who it does not serve and feel confident about
Mm,
that. And I thought that was such a useful lens because every decision we make involves trade-offs, right? If I choose to, make a home repair, that comes at the trade-off of, maybe being able to go for my niece's birthday. And that's life. We have to, make trade-offs, but we should be prepared to defend them based on who a policy does not advantage. Now, transportation funding is, sort of separate. The FAA gets their funding authorization separately from surface transportation reauthorization, and I'll confess that I have not been too heavily involved in the federal, funding like budget development. I have colleagues and peers who are very, very capable and talented in that space, and we are seeing some very positive changes in response to, incremental findings. But I mean, when you look at the question, who gets funded and who gets left behind, I think there's two ways of looking at it. One, you know, there are a lot of what are called formula fund programs that go to the states based on, some of them are based on population or lane miles, or some of them are focused on safety and target, effective specific
right.
safety improvements in specific areas. But then there are competitive or discretionary grants where state and local agencies have to compete for anywhere between 60 and 120 million dollars or something like that. And the challenge with those were designed to incentivize innovation, to say if you can come up with a really innovative proposal, we'll give you more money. The challenge with that is that a lot of states have really strong contractor support and the habit of engaging that support to win competitive grants, and other states are not equipped to effectively do that. And so what you saw from about 10 years of discretionary grant funding into surface transportation innovation was repeated winners and repeated losers. And that was really
Mm,
demoralizing, and it bifurcated the innovation sort of progress curve where you've got 3 to 5 states really leading the charge, and then a handful that are trying to catch up, but then you've got 30 plus states that really don't necessarily track or aren't able to keep up with the pace of innovation. The other imbalance I think that's worth noting is small businesses, and you and I have talked about this a lot. There's a funny clip on every like late night show or something, where you hear politicians in this chorus of small businesses are the backbone of America or of the American economy. And they're just not prioritized effectively. And regardless of some of the more recent program changes, I don't see enough sort of cultural value at at the state and federal level for those programs in the really scaled work. There's small business set-asides and there are things like that. And that's getting better, but small businesses really can make a huge difference in not just how quickly they can innovate, but how much they can tailor an innovation to the specific agency's process or needs, where bigger companies tend to say, here's a product you can buy from me. We'll customize it a little bit for you. But over the life cycle of using that product, that's a lot more expensive than having something that was sort of purpose built for just the variance across different states. So
yeah,
I guess the last part of your question, dealing with multiple modes, I think that, how much your local or state government prioritizes transit is based on local cultural values in a lot of regards. Obviously, transit is always after the fact, but I have such a serious problem with private tolling. It does seem to me like those contracts were very poorly negotiated and they're such long-term leases.
Yes.
It is positive that a lot of that money does have to go towards multimodal improvements that are outside of that specific roadway corridor. That said, I can't say I'll never be on board because I don't like to say never, but it would be so difficult to convince me that private tolling serves is a valuable stewardship of our nation's right of way. So those are my hot takes.
I can't believe you went there because I was like, oh my God, talk about a controversial topic for when I used to live off the Dulles Toll Road.
Oh, I know.
And okay, to be fair, there are ways around the toll road. They will make it very painful for you, right? So it's never here's a, easy alternative to the Dulles Toll Road. But it almost kind of forces you, almost kind of holds certain people hostage in that, do I want to see my children before they go to bed and be stuck in this traffic? Or do I go into debt and account for, asking for a higher salary or some type of reimbursement or compensation for that because now I have to take some people they can't get around, doing that. But it does seem to really favor the haves and the have-nots. And so, if you can afford to do it, you'll do it. And I was really surprised that when the toll road going from Tyson's to Arlington, what is that strip of the toll where it was it got to be insane. One time I was running so late going to DC, I told my Uber driver, take it. I don't care what it is, just take it. And it was over a $50, toll just to get, I was like, oh, that's the last time I do that. But, you're right. That's not the issue.
That's not even atypical, really. I mean, $50 certainly, but if I get on the toll road and my choice is getting to work on time and keeping my job or paying $20, right? They were originally published in the Washington Post as Lexus lanes. That's widely, known about how they're used and regarded. And I'll tell you this, at a community event, I raised this topic and an entire high school stadium of people went wild because it is so unpopular, not just in Northern Virginia, but in Hampton Roads. And, it's just a mismatch of interests and incentives.
Yeah.
And that's sort of my through line on policy is we can make anything possible if we can be candid enough to align interests and incentives, proportionately. But my other thing is these are all foreign banks. I don't really understand why we decided it was a good idea to lease our, some of our key assets to foreign banks who have absolutely no interest in, American taxpayer, wallets. But the proposed innovations, not in Virginia, but in another state where, we were looking at an innovative tolling contract, and their proposed innovations were things like kids shouldn't count as occupants and we should toll on the weekends. And I was like, these are not innovations. This is price gouging. I can't sign off on an emerging tech contract where that's, the proposed innovation. And it does seem like underusing our American ingenuity right, to solve this problem, all because I feel like Grover Norquist villainized the gas tax. And I'm like, of all the taxes people shouldn't care about, the gas tax is where like people really feel pain at the pump. But, I
Yeah.
think it's something like 1 cent increase in the gas tax at the federal level would generate, I don't know if it's 100 million or $1 billion, but lots and lots of money, right? That then gets returned into those projects. So private tolling
You're,
will always be my my arch nemesis
you're,
in this sector.
yeah. Yeah, exactly. Right. And I don't know if you know this now, but Henry is 16 and he's driving. So he's feeling the gas,
Oh
the
yeah,
gas crunch. He was complaining the other day, oh my God, I just filled up my gas tank. I was like, yeah, you're welcome
yeah.
for, taking you around. But one last question I wanted to follow up on before we move to the next segment is, um, as far as the imbalance between like the different communities, the states and the communities that kind of fall behind or either are not successful or I guess I don't want to say like not prioritize it, but maybe they have other fish to fry or whatever. Do they ever catch up? Or is it one of those things that you're seeing that if you're behind and you're like, you're constantly underperforming or not being effective or successful, that you never really quite get to the point where you are. And so at some point, like you said, it kind of is defeating, right? You're like, peace out. I'm gonna, like, why even bother? Do they get apathetic and kind of do that? Or have you seen instances where, or communities have actually caught up?
I mean, one thing I like to reiterate whenever I speak outside of a sort of strictly transportation audience is, with AI and all this new technology coming at us, it's really easy to think like, can't we optimize some of this performance? And we certainly can leverage, new technology effectively to improve performance. But no two roads are the same, right? White stripes,
Yeah.
yellow stripes, no two roads are the same. When I drive down Glebe Road, I know what the access, constraints are. I know when capacity gets exceeded. I know that road. That is not the same as any other 2-lane corridor in the country. And so you have these local transportation engineers that work, within their jurisdiction, and they know that system really well. There are troves and troves of documented, proven safety countermeasures and, different taxonomies for how to improve safety, how to improve ridership, how to improve throughput. But there has to be political support. It has to be a political priority. There's one city in the country that's achieved Vision Zero, which is USDOT's goal of, zero fatalities. And it's Hoboken, New Jersey. And it was a sustained political campaign to, lots of different things, but mostly
Yeah.
removing parking near intersections because that shortens your line of sight
Yeah.
to the pedestrian. And small businesses didn't like it because that's where their customers park. But ultimately, if you have trade-offs of you get 3 more haircut appointments per day or one person loses their life, that's an
Yeah.
easy trade-off, right, to justify. And so it has to be a political priority for the local government because it does require, we always say that transportation innovation requires a, technical champion and a procurement champion. Like you have to have somebody willing to push through the hurdles and all that stuff. And if the folks in charge of procurement don't think that it's a political priority or that they don't have political support, they won't do it because it's a risk.
Yeah.
So I
Well,
think
what a
communities
great segue.
can catch up, but they do need to advocate at the political level, which,
Yeah.
is always my least
Everything's
favorite
political, right? Like that was my other major was political science and chemistry. So it, like I said,
You got
it's all
everything covered,
political.
Don.
I got everything covered. But I think this is a huge, like, this is a great segue into like our next segment where we're going to talk about policy, power, and civil rights, and the CUNY impact that has on transportation. So, like you said, transportation decisions, like they don't just move people; they kind of shape who has access to jobs, to healthcare. economic mobility. Where do you see transportation policy directly impacting these communities, especially when it comes to equity and disparate ESL today impact? And so I kind of want to kind of keep this a little bit practical rather than theoretical, um, in like, projects, transit availability, and like some long-term effects on these decisions that they have on communities.
Oh yeah. I mean, your access to jobs is so spot on. I think it was Los Angeles that did a study that said, having a car in Los Angeles gave you like 60 times access to 60 times more jobs than transit dependents. And that at the national level is sort of comparable where, typically only about 30% of jobs are accessible within 90 minutes by transit. And that means that 70% of jobs require a car. We have a very, very long-standing love affair with the automobile. I understand the convenience, the privacy, the sense of identity, the freedom. I do understand that, but Europe has gone from about 10 years behind us to 10 years ahead of us in about 5 years by taking really decisive action on things like speeding and alcohol use and these other elements where I was driving in France, and if you go 5 kilometers over the speed limit, it beeps at you constantly, like your seatbelt does now.
Oh,
And
it's like a nanny speed, or like a
it totally
speed
is. And
nanny cam
actually,
or what?
nanny state was invented. The term was coined about transportation. It was about use of automated license plate recognition. So, like, I don't expect that America will change its love affair with the car overnight, but I do think that when you see things like, protected bike lanes are one of my absolute favorite things to see in a city. And it probably took a
A
decade to
while.
experiment with
Yeah.
just paint on the sidewalk to say like bikes will be here, and realizing that's not really safe enough, to the little plastic batons, to actually barrier or parking segmented bike lanes. Now the challenge is they have to be contiguous, right, throughout
Yes.
major routes, and that requires major road reallocation. But you also see a lot of ridership, and it improves people's quality of life, right? Like I had a coworker who had a family history of heart disease, and he's sitting in traffic for 50 minutes at least every way, getting stressed out, being frustrated before he even gets to work, right?
Right.
And just being able to bike to work, if people can do it, they love to do it. The people I know who bike to work love to bike to work. And so I think it is through like iterating and taking risks and being an advocate for the fact that there are other better ways of getting around. I love taking transit to work because I would prefer to read than drive, and I tend
Yeah.
to carry my forgiveness beads at folks. But I have to take a shuttle to a bus to a train, right? And that's not totally realistic on a regular.
Requires a lot of planning and a lot of
Yeah,
thoughts.
yeah, and I think
So
that's
you have to be very deliberate about it. Yeah.
absolutely. I think it requires local advocacy to increase those things. There are also a lot of really cool new technologies that I think gamification, for example, has taken off, where a lot of transit agencies use these sort of like video game based simulations to get people to weigh in on what routes they need, right? And to sort of like people
Interesting.
will buy in and do it more if it's fun. But for figuring out like where would increase transit service, even, I like taking the bus. My niece loves riding the bus with us because she can look out the window and point at things. And I am just an overgrown toddler, and I love to look outside, the window. And I strongly believe in, improvements in transit and things like bike lanes, walking trails. All of that stuff is so good for community health.
Yeah. Well, I think you're right. And I love the statistics that you gave about the access to jobs, based on your access to transportation. And I do wonder sometimes, because I live in a very different community now than where I was before. Now, that's not to say that the Woodlands, Texas is so much different than, Reston, Virginia, because again, two planned communities in two very different states. We have toll roads too, but not quite to the same extent that, that Reston did. Um, but it is kind of funny how geographically we do put a different emphasis, on access to um, public transportation. And we joke like Houston has a rail system, but it's a joke, right? It's got a bus system, but we're so big, and that's the other thing is that I know that when I used to live in Virginia, I maybe may have taken or wanted to have taken the metro more if it had more convenient connection points, right? So this whole spoke, circular, like, lines going a certain way, but what happens to like the dead zones, right? Like
Mhm.
how do you get to, some of those locations, which could be really, a really large geographical area, in some instances. And then the, you know, unpredictability of things kind of being down. So I think that there are challenges to to all of that, but you're right, it does need to be something that's driven policy wise locally, and politically for things like that to kind of move forward.
Well, and there are emerging techno policy solutions. Like there are, I think in Texas, there are sort of micro transit on demand programs where, the city can subsidize, right, ride sharing or ride hailing services
Hmm.
as the last mile from transit. I I strongly think that one of the best uses of, automated vehicle are for those sort of low speed trips around a neighborhood where you could pick up 6 people, right, and go drop them off. And it's sort of like a customized bus route, right, that gets you
Yeah,
home. I don't think we're close to having AV shuttles that are ready to navigate those sort of like organic pathways, but, we never incentivized ride sharing when we let Uber and Lyft and others into our
yeah.
ecosystems. They called themselves ride sharing, I believe, because they wanted to get around being a taxi company, which was subject to different regulations
It
in
is
California.
glorified. They are glorified taxis,
And
but
they absolutely have, created sharing options, but they've never incentivized it. And that probably needs to be a policy layer because we can't expect private companies to voluntarily deprioritize their profit. We have to, create an incentive where that makes it useful. So I think, I hope that those sorts of like transit on demand for last mile solutions can improve accessibility, access to transit. Um, but I think that they do have to take into account, Uber low cost options because, a $5 short trip on top of the rest of the trip, for example, can still be cost prohibitive. And I suspect maybe there are similar statistics on access to healthcare. I imagine that would be a lot harder to get good data on than employment access. But, people going to the doctor, people getting to education, like all of that is part of a community's vitality. Like I think of transportation as our circulatory system, right, for the economy.
mhm.
So if our transportation underperforms, um, I was going to say one last thing, but I can't remember what it was. If it comes back,
Come to you.
I'll let you know.
That's all right. Um, so let's move into our next segment, about are we ignoring some of the warning signs, about safety incidences. And there have been a lot of headlines recently, near misses, some pretty tragic accidents, that have hit kind of headlines, and they're kind of signals, to some other challenges and issues. And this segment is not about pointing fingers or or anything like that, but when you look at some of the recent incidences and the near misses, including the Potomac midair collision, the runway, like, incursions, some of the broader aviation, because those tend to be the ones that get national attention, right? What are they telling us about the system level type of risk? And again, I understand that air challenges and risk are very different than, let's say, you know, the roads and rails. But I kind of want to move this conversation beyond just what happened and into what these incidences really kind of reveal about our infrastructure or systems, the strain, the operational pressure, not only on the systems, the SCADA systems themselves, but even like the human, the human factor behind that, and the resilience of the transportation network.
Yeah. Well, I can't talk about aviation without a hat tip and a deep bow to my mother who got me into engineering in the first place. Aviation is
I love your
definitely
mother.
her domain.
Call
She
out to your mom.
Everything I'm about to say is sort of the armchair expert of being privy to lots of dinner conversations with her over decades. But I mean, aviation still is really the safest mode of travel in the US,
When you
right?
think about it, yes.
We went 16 years without a commercial aviation fatality. That is unmatched by any other country in the world or any other mode, really. I mean, transit is very, very safe, also, generally speaking, with taking out some specific types of accidents. But, this problem, it's actually difficult to point fingers in this domain because this problem has been a decade or more in the making with the air traffic controller shortage. I mean, you're like 20% down what the staffing levels that we should have. And that has repeatedly been underinvested in by Congress. I believe that there were multiple reports from the FAA calling for, increasing the level of investment in air traffic controller hiring and training. And these are not jobs that you can do a, quick program on. You have to go to an academy, and there are some interesting modern solutions like digital towers, where for smaller airports and there's just much lower volume traffic, you don't need eyes on the runway the way you do at the major airports. But that's kind of a longer term, solution for compiling, for consolidating air traffic controllers at smaller airports. That said, doing that sooner would free up those traditionally trained air traffic controllers. I mean, I don't think that gets us to the probably 3,500 air traffic controllers that we're short. I mean, the air traffic control system itself, is in need of modernization. That's something, Secretary Duffy has certainly spoken to, and there is a lot of funding, I think some $12 billion under discussion. But it's easy to think we could throw money at that problem. One thing I think that the entire technology sector underestimates when they come to the transportation sector and say, how can we make money, making things better here? These are massive capital infrastructure systems with a life cycle of like 30 to 50 years, right? This is not update the vehicle software overnight while it's parked in the garage type improvements. I mean,
turn on a switch, turn off a switch. Like it doesn't happen like that.
And there are plenty of technology replacements that are really cool. I mean, the radar systems that used to monitor airfields, movement for vehicles, they took a lot of custom calibration. They were very expensive. They were dated. They had limited performance. Now you put a camera out there with machine vision on top of it. You can program, automatic zones and, vehicle detection types. That there are some really high performance upgrades to technology operations. I think near miss analytics and machine vision is probably the single most important safety benefit to come out of autonomous vehicles research. And I always say that's more of a moonshot for the purpose of generating other component technologies than it really is for safety. That storyline kind of fatigues me in the news that AVs are safer. But to get back to aviation, right? Demand is outpacing our improvements to supply. We've got, lots of systemic issues. I did watch the 7-hour NTSB board meeting, on the DCA crash. And there are very few people I have as much respect for. I have no more respect for anyone than Chair Jennifer Homendy of NTSB. She is She knows her stuff. She's very well mediated. She's effective. And I think it should give everyone a lot of confidence that she's in charge right now.
Hmm.
But there are systematic failures, and it's not just aviation. Aviation is just sensational, right? Roadway
Yeah.
fatalities were declining and then have since climbed, and now we're really stuck around 40,000 deaths. Um, I think that when we look at where money should go into innovation, right now we have a federal alignment problem. The federal R&D, research and development, like I mentioned at the beginning of my career, nobody, including the states, could really imagine what the Internet of Things or full connectivity would look like
Yeah.
at a city scale. And their job was really to prototype things and show the states what was possible and estimate the benefits and the ROI of making those investments. They've stayed in that lane of trying to prototype things rather than spending that same money on governance and, sort of coordination amongst the states. Right now, one of my passion projects is, exploring what road weather resilience looks like during major flooding events and other sort of natural disasters. Lots of states have had to deploy roadway inundation sensors to say where and when a roadway is flooded.
Yeah.
And they'll generate alerts to their local, emergency management services or the Office of Emergency Management. Those systems aren't going to independently grow to be interoperable, right? And you don't want FEMA dealing with a multi-state emergency getting
No.
it's 13 different types of flood alerts, let alone all of the other, different kinds of alerts and sensors that we might be integrating. And, if we took the early adopters and said, okay, what works really well about what they've done? What are the outstanding challenges? Where are there, vendor dependence issues? And we issued guidance and then facilitated other states, implementing those systems, we would be in a better situation. So a lot of times it's that we're not putting money into the right part of the problem. And I think that's true across at least, passenger vehicle transportation and air traffic. I can't speak as much to transit innovation because it's been a long time since I had a transit client. But yeah,
Yeah.
it really is, I think, a systematic challenge where because of autonomous vehicles around 10 years ago, everyone got so excited about technology and transportation. And I'm delighted because that's fueled my career. But we have to keep in mind, this is not all software as a service. These are major capital safety critical systems. There's 30,000, no, there's 44. The FAA handles about 44,000 flights per day. There's a billion trips per day on the American roads. So,
Yeah. So it's
the
so much more.
the
Yeah. And,
scale of a
and,
solution comes from coordination of the solution as much as the component innovation itself.
exactly. And that's the reason why I kind of set up this conversation to say that air traffic gets all the glory, all the blame, and all the attention. But you're right. If you think about how many people are on the roads, how many cars, and living in Houston being the fourth largest city in the country, we've got some we've got some big highways. And my 16-year-old has driven on a 20-lane highway down here, which bless his heart, he did just fine. But I kind of wonder sometimes we focus so much on vehicle safety, and how safe and what safety features come on vehicles, that is the same attention, or the same focus kind of placed on the actual infrastructure of said vehicles that are being driven on, right? So there are, I know that, we all know these roads, and you mentioned Glebe for one of them. But there are some roads when I'm back in the DMV that I don't like to drive because I feel like they are unsafe. It's a big old cluster. And so what can we do? Or are we just kind of, I guess, to our earlier conversation, it is kind of local community politically driven as to whether or not they will get the attention. But there are ways to make our roads safer to drive on, physically speaking. And, the way that we funnel traffic either in and out of certain areas, that would make it much safer.
Yeah. Well, this is going to be a hot take question because I get in trouble for saying this even in small groups. But I think there is a certain level of acceptance amongst the American public of roadway fatalities. 40,000 deaths is some years lower than the number of people who die from the flu. When you factor in, motorcycles, excessive speeding, drunk drivers, right? Like our roadways are pretty safe, except for some really specific anomalies. And, with speeding, for example, you mentioned vehicle safety. Our cars are so much safer than they, were before, with not just airbags and, seatbelts, but alerting systems, automatic emergency braking, where, even with a false positive, even if the car brakes for you when you don't want it to, God, what a difference that can make in a collision. If your car braked before you could, to buy you those extra seconds or milliseconds of speed differential reduction. I think that we've got to start getting a little bit more innovative from the policy side. I mean, the vehicle manufacturers struggle because everything they add to the car makes them more expensive, and they are competing in a very kind of thin margin market, especially internationally right now. China, when I was in Mexico, there were so many of the Chinese electric vehicle cars out on the road, and they are much more affordable. Even if they were for sale in the US market, I wouldn't buy them for the same reason I didn't buy a Tesla or one of these other companies. I really love that I can go to any maintenance person around me and do that. But I think the vehicle manufacturers could easily sell that speed alert, right, as extra that you would have to pay extra for. And there are lots of parents of teens or, just families that would choose to opt into that, and that can lead to a cultural pressure of, that social pressure of like, why do you need to speed so much that right? Because it is hard. Like there are roads where I want to go faster because the flow of traffic, the demand is lower. I know these roads. I feel like I can go faster. If something was beeping at me, I wouldn't do it. Right?
Yeah.
So getting creative about how we incentivize Americans to change their behavior is certainly part of it. I think the other part of it is recent administrations on both sides of the aisle have been much more partisan in their priorities, and they get way outside the median consensus of what is important and what's needed. And that back and forth from administration to administration not only diverts our attention, but there's that cost of task switching, right? And we really do know what the safety elements are. I think my second priority for safety is really resilience. I mean, when you look at what the military needs to know for force projection, for deploying off different sides of the country, we do not have the information to answer their questions effectively if they really did have emergencies. Our strategic ports, I think, are supposed to be able to convert to military operation within 48 hours. And I think it would take like 4 months to facilitate that transition effectively, because ports are, they have foreign flag operators and there's multiple kind of owner operators within a given site. Yeah. And we really have not focused enough on, I had a coworker who was going down to her garage during the freeze in Austin to charge her phone. And she was starting to get stressed about like, this is essentially my power source. But if I drain it and we had to evacuate and go somewhere, what if our car won't start? And like, that is not a situation I would wish on any person or family, let alone a mother with young children, where like they were all huddled into one room and we're not looking at grid stability. I mean, all that electrification momentum, there was like UPS and USPS and Amazon were all saying, they would fully electrify their fleets by 2030. And I was like, I think we'd have rolling black and brownouts, at least in Texas, if not elsewhere, because that would be a huge grid demand. Now we're seeing AI and data centers, and we've got a whole different grid.
It's a whole,
grid demand
that's a whole
problem,
other.
But Yeah,
Yeah, no, that's a whole other episode in its own, Julie. But yes, I could totally, we could talk about the electrical grid and
oh,
data centers for hours.
I know.
Um, but you touched on, you started talking about like innovation, which is the next topic that I kind of want to talk about.
Mhm.
Because I don't think, like, I don't think innovation's the problem. It's always the scaling issue. That is the challenge. And we're not short on ideas. But we are short on aligning those ideas to being able to like scale. And so why do you think so many like promising, transportation innovations fail to scale beyond like pilots or ideas? And I think you've kind of alluded to, to some of the challenges.
Mhm.
And like when you think about the future, things like connected systems, the smarter infrastructure, coordinating our emergency responses itself is a challenge. And like sharing some of that like digital and physical infrastructure, like what do we have to change in order to kind of make some of that, possible? I know we can do it. And I'd like to think that it's not because of silos or like funding challenges, but I don't know. I'm just going to toss it out there.
Yeah. Yeah, we're planning a Texas Technology Task Force meeting for June around the idea of stewardship. And, public agencies are stewards of not just the taxpayer dollar, but of the public interest. And, I think there's two or three main challenges. The simplest answer to why innovations don't scale is we dramatically underestimate the cost of new technology. The cost for a pilot is not representative of the life cycle cost of a technology. You have to, implement training. You have to change your cybersecurity posture. You have to add it to your asset management, plan. You have to check or be able to check that the system is working the way that it's supposed to. And, what we get sold the technology for is, I would guess, less than 15% of its, O&M cost for 5 years. And so you look at states like Texas, who are very well resourced, very mature in their emerging technology programs, and they struggle because those pilots that they may have gotten, for example, competitive grant funding for, become an unfunded burden in the long term. And because they got that money from the state, from the feds, they didn't have to go to their state legislature and say, hey, we need this money for a pilot. And that sort of like kept them out of the, it went around the middleman who is always normally there. So I think underestimating O&M costs is, or like the full impact of new technology adoption. That footprint is much bigger than where it plugs into power and where it plugs into comms and where it's mounted. That said, it is still expensive to put out and maintain hardware. I mean, what I hear a lot of folks talking about for rural safety is it's too expensive to get, CCTV camera coverage of rural roadways. There's not always fiber out there. There's not always power, contiguous power out there. And so, instrumenting that is a big cost. But then your time to response when there's a crash, right? If the agency can't auto detect it, then you're waiting for a call to come in, right? And then the location and all of
Yeah,
that
that
stuff is
becomes like a public safety issue.
absolutely. I think the second challenge is coordination that, Texas can, or North Carolina or, Minnesota can do all they want to try and innovate, but they are not paid, they don't have enough funding to go coordinate with their neighbors. And the feds have not historically hosted enough peer exchange events to be able to say, here are all these new technologies. The third thing I would say that blends in here is a comfort talking about failure. When you're innovating, you will fail. Something will not work out the way you expected it to. And that is not ingrained in the culture of public servants to
No.
talk about failure. And I've done many conference, panels on getting comfortable. And I've had conference organizers say like, can't we change it to best practices or lessons learned? And I'm like, no, because that doesn't
No.
capture what's normal here. It's normal. Like we had an agency talk about they executed a successful contract for or a procurement for an AV shuttle, and then the AV shuttle company went out of business, right? They didn't even think to ask that because that's not part of their normal procurement risk, because you don't, contract for a bridge and
Don't
the
expect,
company goes,
yeah.
oh, we've gone out of business. That isn't part of our ecosystem. So sharing lessons learned and best practices would be another thing. And then the last leg of that stool is federal coordination. We do need to figure out what are the sort of minimum viable products that there need to be compatibility and coordination on, and they need to be able to do that. But they've been very hesitant to take on like a data host role for saying, we'll,
Yeah.
coordinate all the data, we'll compare it. And some of that is because their favorite contractors or their longest standing contractors are defense contractors who don't work with state and local agencies. It's not part of their business model. Transportation is already a small subset of what their larger companies do. And so we'll see turnover, but it does take, I think the biggest challenge we have in transportation the last 10 years has been all of this hype and potential has made us look at the short term, right? We overestimate, this is very human, we overestimate what change is possible in the short term and we underestimate what's possible in the long term. I don't think that by the end of next year, Americans are going to say, I'll pay, $50 a year for a speed alert that's going to censure me for when I go over the speed limit. But I do think that kind of cultural change is possible over time. And
Yeah.
balancing that pressure is really difficult.
Yeah. And I think you will see pockets of that, right? Like in certain areas, because I know, and I'm guilty, I'll admit it, when I hit a certain section of like 290 or Route 10 as I'm heading out to like Austin and my speed limit is like 85 or 75. Well, the speed limit is 75, so that means I can go to 85. And even my new car knows that it will automatically go up to 85 and I'm just fine from a speeding perspective. I look forward to that stretch because I'm like, yes, I can, like let loose. It will take us some time to kind of like retrain ourselves, to kind of do that. But I think you hit like the nail on the head, which is kind of systemic for challenges, regardless of what topic we're talking about. Today, we're talking about transportation and infrastructure. If you were to talk about education or healthcare or whatever from a state and local to a federal perspective, who's funding, who's taking lead on the policy, the initiative, the governance. There's always that friction, and that was kind of how and why our country was created, right? Is to have the separation between the state and the federal government, states' rights. And so there is a part of me who is, yes, I want my state to be reflective of me and what our values are and what our initiatives are. And but then there's the other side of me who has seen the impacts, and the importance of when the federal government sets the tone, sets the initiative, sets the strategy for how everyone should operate, that there are times where that needs, like, someone needs to be the parent, right?
Right.
In the room, and someone needs to kind of set the tone and set what's important so that everybody else can kind of like get on board, because sometimes no one wants to be that person who sticks their neck out.
Right.
And you're right, we live in such a instant gratification, instant results, type of society, that if we don't see results within the next 9 months, 12 months, within the term of whoever is in office, then we think it's been a complete failure. And I think it's because you and I are kind of inside the beltway a little bit. We kind of see how the sausage is made, and we realize we're a little bit more patient than that, because you can't make this happen overnight. And there are reasons, I think, why a balance between public sector and private sector needs to find some type of a balance, because you can't have commercial companies coming in and just upheave, like the infrastructure and things like that, because for various reasons, they don't have to live with it. They could go out of business, or they can go on to like the next, the next thing. And we can't govern, and we can't make sure that, we're caring for the public in this, fast and furious kind of way, without having some very, deliberate, and thoughtful and strategic type of, thought process behind all of that.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, absolutely.
it's a delicate balance, right? So let's close out with like our last segment here, from vision to execution, where progress really starts. And I'm a big executor. Like I love the big ideas. They're easy, they're fun, but implementation is hard. It's where all the work is. It's where like things break. It's where we fail,
Yeah.
along the ways. And so if the goal is to move from like this fragmented, innovation to more of a coordinated transportation system, what's really the starting point? Like, where do organizations get it wrong, where they're trying to like engage in this space, this transportation space? And like, what really kind of separates this meaningful execution from good intentions? Because I think everybody involved has good intentions.
Yeah.
It all comes down to like, how do we execute, and can we execute?
Well, I think owning the problem is more challenging than it sounds. I constantly hear organizational and political leaders get up and repeat the 40,000 death statistic. And that's, to me, a signal that they are cueing an emotional justification for something that they otherwise cannot defend. I think some of our investments in innovation are indefensible right now. I think we're looking very much indefensible. I think we're looking very much at short-term, really edge case possibilities, rather than saying we've been doing this for 10 years. What are the solutions that had the most measurable benefits? How do we make those commercially sustainable or commercially viable? And then how do we scale them to as many agencies as possible? And with surface transportation in particular, Federal Highway is not a regulatory body. They do not mandate. I mean, the reason that you have different speed limits in different states is because that's not mandated by the federal government. Federal Highway does not own or operate a single mile of roadway in the country. They govern through funding and best practices. They issue best practices and they publish those things, but that has not been a focus area of theirs for a long time. They've been focused on prototyping, new possibilities, and there wasn't private capital in this sector when they started. That was absolutely true. But I think it's indefensible that we've spent 10 years investing in prototyping things that aren't even consistent with how either the public or private sector would do it. And so I think it takes leaders. I genuinely think that, to your point, that the visioning is easy and fun. The execution is harder. I think it's just as challenging for a leader to say, I am going to set a modest improvement goal with an aggressive scale goal. That is a lot harder. I mean, we can pilot anything these days. We've got cheap manufacturing. Everyone's got a 3D. Lots of people have a 3D printer. I don't, but I have friends who do, right? Everyone's so excited about Raspberry Pis and how sort of democratized this has become. And I think that's really, really cool. But I think we have a backlog of proven solutions that there just hasn't been enough political will to tackle. And for example, with Federal Highway, the hard part of the problem is to say, we will create a back end and pay for and sustain ingesting all of this data, not to store it forever, but to say, for flood alerts, which of these systems is the most accurate, right? Are there compatibilities between these states' data sources such that FEMA could digest it? Or are we the intermediary broker where every state can kind of generate it themselves, will consolidate those alerts? Can we do that in a timely manner, right, with the accuracy required? So I think that our biggest problem is there are so many shiny objects that we've been chasing rather than focusing on the boring but really important work that has to be done to scale the innovations we already saw worked. Like, if we aren't using what we already proved could work effectively enough, why would we move on to the next thing? When it does tend to further segregate. And I think it was Walt Disney's daughter, who said something about how eye-opening it was to travel not private for the first time. She'd grown up flying on private jets,
Right.
and going into an airport was completely different for her. And that has always stuck with me, because whether it's Lexus lanes, whether it's, Uber Black and Uber XL or Uber at all, right? We have segmented the performance of our transportation system socioeconomically very badly, that the decision makers often don't have the experience of, the worst part of transportation systems failures. I think that's why it was when Senator Kaine from Virginia was stuck on 395 for that 13-hour delay. I think people sort of loved that story, because it was like, yeah, if we have to get stuck, you should have to get stuck. And we do, and myself included, like, I have TSA PreCheck. I bought my way out of the line, and I might travel more often for work than other people, but that also might be how I make myself feel better about, buying my way out of that line. And it doesn't seem fruitful, right, that we would partition our roadway performance that way, when there are some people who, if they're delayed getting to work, it has a much higher cost to society than me. I can probably join my meeting from my phone, or call in, or reschedule or something. A lot of jobs do not have that flexibility. So I think the hard work is focusing on the boring stuff that we already know how to do, and reclaiming from transportation that these should not be political wins, or there are no wins. There are almost no short-term political wins in transportation. I've just never seen it.
No, exactly. And I think, just to kind of like recap and bring it kind of full circle, you mentioned something earlier, is that I think a lot of times the biggest challenge is getting the innovation and implementation in sync and aligned with the acquisition, right? Like, there's always been a disconnect with acquisitions. How do we, procure these services? How do we incentivize, contractors to work either more efficiently? And so there are a lot of performance-based contracts that, there are different, mechanisms that we can kind of put in place to incentivize that. But there is a lot of money to be made making something stretch out and last, and to take 4 or 5 years. Now, we could flip that and say, you could make so much more, and we're more than happy to pay you for it if you did it in a reversed way, right? Like, let's get to the actual, completion and execution of something much quicker. And so, again, we're not going to be able to solve that problem here today.
I had a client say to me the other day that we were talking about stewardship, and she said something about procurement. Oh, the P word. And I was like, it's not a 4-letter word, but it is certainly a bad word in transportation right now, because that is so much the heart of our challenges. Our procurement systems at every level of government were built for roads and bridges and, water infrastructure. Now they're being retrofit for technologies that do not fit in those same shapes.
Yeah.
So that certainly does feel like where it all comes to a point is the P word.
Yeah, it does. So, key takeaways here as we wrap up today's episode on the future of transportation and how and who shapes it. Our takeaways that we've discussed is transportation is not only about infrastructure, but it's about decisions that determine access, investment, risk, and outcomes. The systems is not short on ideas. It's short on alignment, execution, and the discipline to scale what already works out there. Policy and funding choices create real downstream effects for communities, especially around access, opportunity, and long term mobility. And organizations that want to lead in this space really need to understand how the system actually functions, where the trade-offs are, which is the operative word here, I think, and where they can really add some more value. So, Julie, some last parting thoughts here on our discussion today.
Yeah, I am so grateful for the opportunity to be here and speak with you. It's always fun. I mean, my parting words are think long term, be consistent, and as much as we can, update our procurement practices. I think that's the ongoing struggle. But looking at the long term and looking at questioning our underlying assumptions about what is possible, both on the system and technology side and the human behavior and community side. I think COVID taught us that a lot more is possible than we previously thought. And that sort of keeps me going when the challenges pile up.
Well, this concludes our episode here today on Built to Move or Built to Stall, the future of transportation and who decides. Please remember to subscribe to our podcast at Tons 2 Cents on Patreon, Spotify, and YouTube, and stay tuned for future episodes each Wednesday. Thanks, Julie, again for joining us and sharing your knowledge with our intellectuals here today.
Absolutely. Thanks, Ton. Talk to you soon.
Thanks. Thanks again to our intellectuals for listening today. And remember, you have to think big to win big. Be an intellectual. And until next time, keep pushing the boundaries of possibilities.